Hi everyone, so this is my commentary video discussion comprehensive review of the articles. I thought that the articles that were chosen for us were interesting. It seems like they had somewhat of a thread from one to the other, starting with the common factors article. It really sort of laid the groundwork for how we sort of weaved ourselves through each article. So I'm going to try to make this as brief as possible and highlight the themes that came out that stood out for me. In the first article, common factors, I think the biggest thing that stood out for me was it was really isomorphic couples therapy to just the common factors model in general. And I think the biggest thing is having that both and position, that the common factors lens is something that can be funneled through different approaches. And I think that it doesn't have to be an either or. While there's value in models and their sort of distinct approaches, I think when it comes to couples therapy, there are not that many models to me that feel very different. Certainly, there aren't a lot of models that are researched and that are evidence-based research. Really just have EFT and some of them, those two behavioral models, integrative behavioral model and sort of the traditional behavioral couples therapy model. And so I think that a lot of those themes overlap as well, and the article mentions that. And so I think that that is making a case for common factors being that much more needful or useful when it comes to couples therapy. That therapeutic alliance, the relationship between the therapist and the client, those are all things that I think transcend an approach. And so I think that that article essentially just set us up for the second article, which was the couples therapy with military vets. So I thought this article was pretty interesting. There are a couple points here that I have, and I'm just looking at my screen. It was interesting, and I recognize that a lot of couples therapy hasn't been done in this area, and so it was sort of like a preliminary, one of those first kind of studies to just show that there's a need for more study. They really make a case for couples therapy considering the divorce rate. They really make a case for couples therapy with veterans considering the amount of people that have gone to war. I think it was about 2 million or something like that over the last couple of years. So the authors really make a case for couples therapy in this population. However, the study for me fell short in the way in which they gathered their data. Using those two different sites, San Diego and Charleston, I believe, there were such disparate outcomes and differences in the two sites. And so I found it to be really tricky to really take in a lot of the information based on the fact that they weren't able to control for a lot of variables in the sites. First main one being that most of the people cut out early at Charleston. And I think it was like 4 sessions compared to like 11 sessions in San Diego. And so it just felt like there were a lot of, and what I appreciate is the authors highlighted that very clearly. They very clearly and explicitly and transparently shared sort of the places that their study fell short. And I think I've found in a lot of research and academia that missing data goes unaccounted for, and a lot of these differences or a lot of these shortcomings or misgivings go unaccounted for. And so I appreciate that they included it. However, there were major differences in the site. There were major differences in the makeup in terms of race. And so I think on one end that was meaningful in allowing them to be able to look at the benefits of couples therapy with these African American couples, and that it really did make strong outcomes. But on the other hand, there was just such a difference in how in the models and the therapist's ability from each site. So there was just a lot of things for me that were challenging to sort of really digest. But I think all in all, what came out of the article was further need for research in the area of couple therapy, particularly with veterans. And they also sort of synthesized these different areas that felt like common factors as well, these 5 sort of principles that came out. And they felt like those are the overarching goals that you're trying to either achieve or that they saw that were meaningful in this population, regulating emotion, communication, parties feeling heard, those kinds of things that really, in large part, you see in most models. It's just the way in which they sort of come about is different. And so I appreciated that part of it. Let's see where I am. Okay, trying to not make this video too long. And then we get to our third article. And this was research on the treatment of couple distress. And there were a couple things that stood out to me here as well. The first being the relationship between couple distress and individual disorders such as depression and anxiety have become well established. The article really makes a really good case for that. And I think that that's something definitely that I've experienced in my own practice, seeing or doing clinical work, seeing very many couples come in, but they're also one or both parties of the couple is doing their own individual work, working on their own self-regulation as it relates to depression and anxiety. And I think the difference with EFT is that and we've talked about this in class, that EFT looks at that regulation as like a co-regulation, which is what always has drawn me away from EFT, as opposed to the individuals being able to differentiate themselves outside and independent of their partner. But you see that those individual disorders coming up with a couple distress very often. And the authors make a case for more research needing to be done with couples therapy, within couples therapy. That was interesting too, that the article brought up that the male partner's alliance with the therapist was predictive or indicative of stronger outcomes, which I thought was quite interesting. And it had me reflect even too on clinical experience and what my experience with male partners have been in that way. But I thought that was a very interesting detail to note. Pardon me. So the 5 principles that come out actually are in this article. I apologize for that. And they seem to transcend all approaches, and that I agree with as well. There's the emotions, the communication, there's language. And the one thing I think all of these models, including common factors, that even in the individual approach and the family approach, fail to sort of insert, and this is the one thing that I would include, is exploring the socio-cultural and contextual differences of couples. I think that emotion, communication, language are all embedded within the socio-cultural context of couples and individuals in couples. And I think to understand where language comes from and to understand how individuals express themselves, it's needful to understand these sociocultural contexts, which brings me to our last article that talks about gender, that feminist perspective combined with the EFT perspective. Now, this article was quite interesting as well, because I haven't done a ton of research on feminist family therapy. I think it's quite interesting to think about and to even read about here. I don't isolate gender in my thought process outside of other sociocultural contexts. So it's interesting in the article how much sort of gender was really siloed out and focused on as something that needs to be introduced into emotionally focused couples treatment, as opposed to other sociocultural, contextual, marginalized groups. And so while I saw where the authors were going with this, I also saw holes as it relates to other marginalized groups that come up. But I also saw how this framework could work with those populations as well. So I think that it was interesting to see how the blend came together. The authors made a really good case for the similarities that already exist between feminist family therapy or the theoretical model and EFT. And the diverging point is sort of how gender is introduced. And they talk about gender learning in the room and sort of the clinician's responsibility to be aware of providing gender learning, and that if the clinician is not aware of this, and oftentimes they're perpetuating those same stereotypes or generalizations and patriarchal structures, which I completely agree with. When the way they were explaining gender learning to me, it was a bit interesting to think about gender learning in the context of when there are gender practices that are closely linked to religion. How then do you broach gender learning? I think that I understand where the therapists or the theorists are coming from with this. I think that gender, oftentimes, at least a lot of clients that I have, particularly right now, I have a couple of Pakistani clients. And I think when you think about gender, that's often linked to gender practices or gender marginalization. It's often linked to religion. What is the line between respect? And I think this is where the constructionist in me comes in. What's the line between respecting and honoring and privileging the client's voice and their experience with their religion and their gender practices, and equality and justice and those types of things in terms of gender learning? So those are the points that were salient to me and that stuck out to me. And I'm loving or wanting and hoping to hear your thoughts on what stuck out to you most from these articles. I think the common factors approach is crucial. I think that couples therapy needs to be more succinctly and sort of intentionally researched. And I think that a lot of the models that are getting the funding to do the research should incorporate more marginalized populations, as well as there was this huge case made for funding for this population, and we still see that couples therapy is not really an issue or not really a topic that a lot of money is going towards. So it does make you question when you look at money and values or policy and values. This country oftentimes touts, family and morality and, all these wonderful things, and yet with the divorce rate being hovering at 50%, why then wouldn't couples therapy be something to invest in if we really value the traditional sense of family or whatever that is, or sort of the American values based on sort of white capitalistic imperialistic patriarchy? Nevertheless, why isn't money going to support those structures? So love to hear your thoughts. Bye, everyone.